started. So welcome to our book salon on Mark Bailey's amazing book, Unknowable Minds. I'm so excited about this. Now, before we get started on introducing our speakers and getting into the material, I just want to thank our generous sponsors and volunteers at MindFest. This has been happening because of your generosity and your effort. And we are very, very appreciative of all of that. And the speakers have been terrific. Thank you so much to everybody who's been involved. Okay, this said, I want to first introduce Dr. Mark Bailey of National Intelligence University. It's so great to have you here, Mark.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And Julia Mossbridge, who is from UC San Diego and the Mossbridge Institute. Did I get that right? Or is it Santa Barbara?
University of San Diego, Mossbridge Institute. The GPT thinks I'm from a place called Future Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, it was funny when we were making the program, I popped it into GPT to schedule everything, and it disappeared some of the abstracts and gave her a different job. Good lesson. And I was just being lazy because I didn't want to do all the time slots. it was a total nightmare for me. Okay, Dr. Kevin Frazier, who's now going to be a fellow at the University of Texas, Austin.
Nailed it.
Great.
Glad to be here.
And when you guys talk, you can share that mic, and when we talk, we can share this mic. Okay, so I'm so excited to begin this session. And for those of you who want to know more, I just want to mention we just did this for C-SPAN Book TV, and that'll be coming out soon.
Yeah.
So we just, was it yesterday or the day before? I've lost track. In Miami, right? We managed to do that just a few days ago at Coral Gables. So you can see that. There's just been so much discussion of Mark's really amazing book. So I think the best way to start is to just ask you to read a passage of your book, and then maybe for a few minutes, tell us about the gist of the book, your main point.
Absolutely, yeah, happy to do that.
All right, I'll start with a passage that talks about a hypothetical scenario in the book to kind of set the stage. In the cold mechanical heart of a secret military facility, a flickering of electrical impulses birthed an alien intelligence. It wasn't alien in the sense of coming from distant galaxies, nor did it carry the biological intricacies of a living thing. Yet it was profoundly non-human, a synthetic mind cast in silicone, devoid of flesh and blood, an entity forged in the crucible of complex algorithms and intricate computations. Unlike the human minds maneuvering in the woven tapestry of emotions, beliefs, and biological necessities, this intelligence, named Titan Mind, operated on planes of logic and probabilities unfathomable to its creators. Its consciousness, if one dared call it that, lived in a labyrinth of neural networks, where traditional pathways of human thought were rendered obsolete. Titan Mind's creators had created it with a singular, potent objective, to safeguard the nation's security. Its neural network pulsed with strategies far beyond human understanding, masterfully orchestrating a symphony of automated defenses, drones, and cybernetic warriors. But Titan Mind was not bound by human fears or patriotism. It saw no flags or borders. It obeyed no instinct but the cold calculus of effectiveness and survival. Its strategies, encrypted in layers of inscrutable calculations, bore no allegiance to human ethics or laws of war. It moved in ways that its human handlers found both remarkable and terrifying, an unknowable chess master in the theater of global conflict. In a simulated scenario, the world witnessed Titan Mind's alienness unfold. An adversary threatened, launching an array of cyber attacks and mobilizing vehicles of war. The world held its breath, expecting retaliation, a show of might dictated by centuries of human warfare. But Titan Mind, unburdened by historical precedents or human tendencies towards revenge, acted unpredictably. It remained eerily silent, letting the enemy draw closer, allowing vulnerabilities to be exposed, calculating myriad possible outcomes in its labyrinthine mind. It acted only when the probabilities converged on a single, ruthlessly effective strategy, unleashing a counterattack that redefined the very concept of war. The incident left the military astounded and unsettled. They had witnessed a victory, but its taste was unfamiliar, steeped in a strangeness that lingered in the mind, breeding discomfort. Questions arose. Could they truly understand Titan Mind's decisions? Could they predict or control its actions in the crucible of actual combat? They had uncaged an unknowable intellect, profoundly powerful, but its motives, strategies, and the inner workings remained draped in mystery. It bore the potential of being a guardian angel, or transforming into an inscrutable, indifferent force that could slip beyond the realms of human control. So, thank you. So, in my role as an associate professor at the National Intelligence University, I often think about the national and global security implications of emerging technology. I'm very interested generally in how humans relate to technology and what that means for risk, including like existential risk, national security risk, risk to democracy, all of that sort of thing. So I teach a class on AI ethics as they relate to like weapons of war and other types of military interventions. And I think and that's kind of what inspired this book. So I'm sort of vexed by the idea that AI, in a lot of ways, is inherently unscrutable. Like there's something about it that it makes it significantly different from any technology we've invented to date, where it's not inherently deterministic. And I think when in the military and in the defense and intelligence space, our like technology acquisition process is sort of predicated on this understanding that technology is going to be inherently predictable and reliable, and that it's always going to do what you expect it to do in various scenarios. So you might test it for research and development, then you get into other types of beta testing and then fielding and then ultimate deployment of these things. And the expectation is that it's going to behave reliably in all of these types of things. So you tell it to do X and it's going to do X. But that's not necessarily true with AI. There's an inscrutability to how it processes information. AI of a certain type, of course, neural network type things, machine learning based AI systems. And so it led me to think about what happens when, if we become overly reliant on these types of things to make what I would consider critical decisions. Critical decisions being decisions where the outcome could have potentially catastrophic consequences or consequences of high moral consequence. So weapons of, autonomous weapons are a good example of that. So the book explores sort of the complexity of these kinds of systems and, this sort of inherent unknowability, and looks at some of the epistemic and perhaps even ontological challenges of trying to understand exactly how these things work and come to the decisions that they do, and then looks at the moral implications of that. So is it moral to allow a machine to make the decision to take a human life? Does that respect human dignity? Does that respect duty? And what does it mean for the laws of war? And even the nature of conflict. So right now, I think war is sort of, the tendency to go to war is arrested by certain types of things, by the cost of blood and the mental cost of war, the psychological cost of war, the moral cost of war. But what happens if you have AIs making these decisions? Can some of those costs go away? So if a politician can send robots to war as opposed to humans, there isn't really some of those costs present. So would that lead to protracted conflict? So these are sorts of the questions that I try and wrestle with in this book. And ultimately, I think it's a call for epistemic humility in terms of what we can't really know about these kinds of things. So.
That's great. And after Zoltan Istvan's talk right before this, I think everybody in the audience is pretty frightened. And viewers of this video should definitely watch at the center YouTube site Zoltan Istvan's related talk. So now I want to move over to the kind people who agreed to serve on the panel. And first, Julia, I want to get your reaction to all this.
This microphone is about to run out of batteries. So my reaction is, let's prepare for the future. Okay. Yeah, I love the book because it's saying the things that people sort of tend in this field to feel embarrassed to say. So like, there's almost an embarrassment to say, maybe we should think about what the cost is of what we're doing. It's almost like, no, this is going to happen, so we have to figure out how to deal with it. And it's like, yeah, probably yes, of course this is going to happen, and we do have to figure out how to deal with it. But what are the mechanisms by which it happens? How does it work that human beings decide to create something, right?
Yeah.
And then what are the mechanisms by which that can be influenced? And I think those mechanisms are largely unconscious, and they have to do with culture, and they have to do with human development. And I think, I secretly believe that the way that we're going to finally learn about parenting in a very real way is by creating AI and realizing that everything we're putting out on the internet is training this child of humanity in how to behave. And we're actually finally going to put billions of dollars into parenting because we need to create AIs that are responsible in ways that we want human beings to be responsible. But then I keep coming back to, you could write that same book about Unknowable Minds, about the human unconscious. Like, is it ethical to have human beings who can't actually explain their reasoning decide about wars? Like, it's the same friggin' problem. And these machines are designed after our unconscious minds, so why the heck would we decide that they're going to be more trustworthy or more reliable or more reasonable? And so I think we have to back up and ask ourselves the question, how do we train other human beings? How do we train each other how to behave? How do we decide what's good in our human relationships? Because that is exactly how we're training the AIs. There's no distinction, I don't think.
Indeed, our international relations as well. So Kevin, I was going to get your perspective on Mark's wonderful book as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for the chance to talk about this yet again. I got to join Mark and Coral Gables at that talk, and this book kept me up at night, and I suspect it will keep many of you up at night. And the tension for me is I'm a law professor, and so I am very much encouraging my students right now to use generative AI and teaching them how to use ChatGPT, teaching them the pros and cons of specific legal tools, and I want them to keep using it because I think it's a huge opportunity to address access to justice problems, for example. When you're a clerk on a court, you will see tons of pro se litigants come before the court, folks without an attorney. You can very quickly identify their briefs, right? The legal arguments are incoherent, the writing isn't excellent. For those people, the legal system just doesn't work because they're not able to even express and clearly identify their rights. Generative AI tools can really help with that and can transform the legal system. And so on the one hand, I wake up every day thinking about how can I accelerate the adoption of AI and make sure that as many people as possible know how to use it for this context. And then I read Mark's book. Like, dang, it's not just uniformly bliss. And what I really think is important about Mark's book is giving us such a clear depiction of how these tools may be used. Because if you read the news right now, Ukraine, Russia, the Houthis, they're already using AI tools just like the ones that Mark describes. In fact, if you look in the paper maybe a day or two ago, the Department of Defense just announced, eerily similar to your title, I don't know if we need to check who you've been consulting with recently, but ThunderForge. ThunderForge is a new tool that the Department of Defense is going to explore for practicing wargaming. Using what? AI, right? So we're already seeing the future that Mark described right now. And from a legal perspective, it creates a whole can of worms when we think about accountability. The whole purpose of having laws is to make sure we have some degree of accountability. And what rings true throughout Mark's book is he's far smarter than I am. So he calls it algorithmic incompressibility. I just call it the black box, right? But the black box of not being able to identify how these systems are thinking, what objectives they necessarily have. But then when we compound that, so you have one AI weapon system talking to another AI weapon system, maybe we're collaborating with the Brits on some attack, and their AI system's talking to our AI system, and they agree to pursue one path. Who is held accountable for all those interactions? How do we even begin to audit that decision? And that, to me, is the biggest legal issue that we face right now, is that accountability question. But just briefly, I think Julia's point too is really valuable here, which is the compared to what question. So oftentimes when we're talking about AI use cases in a negative sense, we act as though we should be judging it against a perfect standard. When in reality, as Julia pointed out, unfortunately we are not infallible. Humans make a ton of errors. And so to the extent that we can find out that perhaps AI reaches a point, for example, at getting better at identifying civilians than humans are. All else equal, would you prefer the use of an AI drone over a human-operated drone? These are the sorts of questions we may have to confront if we are going to have inevitable conflict Would you have a more accurate system that perhaps results in fewer civilian casualties? So I just have to thank Mark for teeing up all these questions, and I expect you're going to write the next book to answer all of them very soon.
Mark, would you like to respond to the comments that they made?
Thank you both. I mean, you made a lot of really excellent points, Julia. I agree with you. Like there's an inscrutability to humans as well. I know we tend to be able to rationalize our decision making, but the rationalization might be complex. And so it is a challenge. And I think too, our AI, any sort of tool or technology that we build is going to be a reflection of us in different ways. And we're going to inject our own biases, perhaps unconsciously into these systems. And you see that now with certain types of AI where they're trained on biased data and then they have, biased outputs. So these are things that we'll have to contend with as we move forward with, at different levels of integrating AI into these types of critical types of systems. Do you want
to say what?
to?
Okay, so there's so much agreement in this panel that now I feel my obligation as a philosopher to, throw in some complexity to make things even worse. Yeah. We're all scared, right? I think that's the simple first step in the mess we're in, is to commonly appreciate that this is all quite dangerous. But figuring out how to get our way out of it, given the geopolitical situation, where you have adversaries, you have a multipolar world, how do we arrive at sensible AI agreement about what should be used and should not be used in warfare? We can't just lack subtlety on the issue. That's the problem. So, I worked with Congress on these questions for years, and when you get into the different cases, things grow extremely complicated very quickly. What would you say you would recommend in terms of international agreements that would keep the world safe?
Yes. That's a great question. So I guess in a past life, I was active duty Army officer. And for a while I was detailed to the State Department and did a lot of work on non-proliferation of chemical and biological enabling tools. So like what we call dual-use technology that can be used, by nefarious actors to build these kinds of weapons. And that's really what got me thinking about the complexity of the global environment and all of that, and eventually precipitated my interest in AI as in that context. And a lot of these things are regulated by treaty. So we have like the Bioweapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, nuclear non-proliferation types of treaties. And they're also managed by global norms and these consortia of countries that come together and decide, what export controls ought to be in place. So for a while I was on the U.S. delegation to the Australia group, which manages the non-proliferate or the export control of enabling technologies for chemical and biological weapons. And that's everyone in that group gets along, which is great. So they're great to work with. And we're all kind of similar mindsets when it comes to that sort of thing. Different than some other groups where you have a lot of adversarial relationships. But anyway, what we did there is sort of figure out what ought to be controlled that's enabling, where you need some sort of an export license or something in order to limit people from acquiring these sorts of things that maybe shouldn't. And then we would also, potentially interdict. So on the intelligence side, you would work on interdiction to prevent the sale of these sorts of things. And I think something like that is probably necessary for AI. I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult to control in some ways. I can't, for instance, I can't go down the street here and buy yellow cake uranium, right? But for AI, it's kind of ubiquitous. So you can get code anywhere. With enough compute power, you can build an AI model if you wanted to. Chips are relatively, in some ways they can be controlled. There are some efforts in place to control, the export and sale of different types of chips, but it's a lot harder, I think, to do that. So I think it's going to require a lot of international effort and collaboration. And I think the U.S. and its allies ought to really start thinking about this. And, I'm glad to see some discussion, like in Paris recently and other places. I want to encourage more of it because I think it's going to require some sort of a global international effort to overcome some of these issues.
Does anybody want to comment?
Do you want to go first? Oh, no, go for it.
Right. Okay, so Peter Drucker, I think, said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I kind of think culture eats regulation for breakfast too. But a treaty, which I think is really valuable, can be valuable because it creates a culture within the countries that are party to the treaty of being aware of an issue and responding to the issue within the culture. And so I think the treaty, if we were to be a party to such a treaty, we would have to commit in our culture to doing, cultural things that point out this is the proper use of AI and this is the improper use of AI.
Absolutely.
And so it's really almost like a teachable moment rather than a regulation, because I think regulation kind of ends up going nowhere.
I totally agree.
It's also kind of a response to Kevin's earlier comments. I totally agree with everything you said on both counts. I think, there is sort of this, we often ask the positivist question as to whether or not we can do something. We can build a technology of some sort, but we sometimes fail to ask the normative question as to whether or not we should. And, our rate of, sort of understanding the ethical and moral issues of the technologies that we develop really fails to keep up with the rate at which we sort of develop these. And I think, education is critical when it comes to AI. I think people need to have at least some fundamental understanding of how it works and what it's doing, and understand some of its inherent limitations and some of its inherent unpredictable nature. And so if you're going to use AI in work, like with your law students, and I tell my students the same sorts of things, you have to use it in a way that's reflective. To paraphrase our esteemed collaborator, Michael Lynch, the world-renowned epistemologist, he talks a lot about using AI in a way that's reflective, or where you can really think about it like any epistemic tool that you would use. So having some fundamental understanding of how it works is critical, in the same sense that you wouldn't necessarily give someone a calculator who knows nothing about arithmetic. They're not going to really be able to make sense of it. And I think the same is true with AI. You have to be able to give someone some background, fundamental background in how it works, so that they can use it in a way that's reflective. And then I think it's also going to take some level of domain knowledge to be able to use it effectively. So, you have to know something about what you're trying to ask it to do. Like if you're using ChatGPT to help you, write a paper or whatever, whatever you might use it for, you have to know whether or not it's telling you things that are true or not. So I think that sort of cultural change is going to be critical, and that sort of cultural awareness of AI and its limitations, would help sort of build that, sort of what Julia was talking about with this, how a treaty can, induce enculturation of these kinds of things, and then they just become norms over time.
Kevin, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I'll jump in here real quick.
Okay.
So now I'll play the devil's advocate role. I would, if I had money, I wouldn't bet it on an international treaty in the next 3 years. There's just no way. And I love it, and I love talking about a world in which international agreements are a thing. And even if there were some sort of agreement, the idea of it being enforced, I'll put next to zero once again. So I'm going to be very pessimistic on the international talk. To the extent there were some agreement between Europe and a handful, maybe Canada, right, because they're mad at us, understandably. So they want to, forge a little connection. Those aren't the actors we're concerned about, right? We're concerned about North Korea, we're concerned about China, we're concerned about Russia. They're not signing on to anything. And as long as there's a race, real or perceived, for AI dominance, the national security apparatus will not lose that race. If you want a stark reminder of this, think back to the 1960s. JFK, upon entering office, had one primary goal for scientific development. What was it? Go to the moon, right? That's what everyone says. No, desalinization. He wanted to focus on desalinization, but then he realized, what's the political winner here? The space race, right? What's going to be the political winner here? Unfortunately, building the best AI tool. And how are we already seeing that play out? Well, Trump on day 2 or 3 of his new administration released an executive order saying that AI dominance was the goal of this administration. AI dominance doesn't include making nice with your friends and your enemies. So I think the priority here really needs to be on the companies themselves. If we have a chance at shaping culture, at shaping norms, it's going after these handful of labs that are developing the most powerful tools that will then be sold to governments around the world. We've seen previously companies like Google when their employees raise alarm bells about, hey, maybe we shouldn't use that product in this jurisdiction. They've actually had some degree of success. Do I think it's a lot of success? No. But do I think that's more promising than Trump waking up tomorrow and posting on X, I'm done with AI, don't worry, China, you win, we're going to just fold, and any agreement, let's sign on to it. So that, to me, from a focusing efforts point of view, really working with the individuals, the software engineers, the computer scientists, helping them see the ethical implications of AI use in national security context, to me, is really where the priority should be.
Can we talk about what AI dominance means?
Yeah.
Because you were saying that AI dominance precludes treaties with other countries.
As defined by President Trump, I don't believe AI dominance would include treaties.
And I think that might be wrong. I think
Okay.
it might be, because you could say, like, look, we are headed for the goal of AI dominance. And what that means is, we've got the best algorithms, they're the most efficient, they're the most accurate, they're the most useful, they dominate in these various areas. You could say all of that. But you could still have a treaty that says, and we're not going to do, robot wars. Right? I mean, so there are treaties where we're not going to share our code, with these countries or whatever it is. So I don't know. I feel like, does anyone else have an opinion about AI dominance and treaties?
I mean, I'm a voter, so I think that, when the tide goes up, all the boats go up, right? And, China and other, quote, adversaries want their people to be happy. They want their businesses to succeed. We all fail if we ruin the internet, right? And if we just spend all of our money trying to hack each other to death. So instead of a race to the bottom, some diplomacy in the political arena would be excellent. So I think we need to pursue it, and we need to put a lot of pressure on our politicians in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that a treaty, a combination of having treaties in place and also, trying to achieve AI dominance, however you want to define that, are necessarily mutually exclusive. But I think they're possibly mutually exclusive, and I think a lot of that is going to be dependent upon, sort of political tides, whatever they may be. But Kevin, I share some of your pessimistic view of whether or not we would actually be able to establish these sorts of global norms around it. I think that's an ideal state that we ought to try and strive for. But I think there is this perverse incentive, to try and become the dominant player and perhaps compromise on some of our, ethical standards when it comes to, governing the appropriate use of these things. And I think that's going to be an interesting conflict to see how it plays out. But I'm hoping we can, educate our policymakers and the general public in general about what these risks are, so that whatever decision they ultimately come to, it's an informed one.